Okay, day 3 of the storytelling project. Last night I reached in the hat and pulled out a topic. I'm going to keep the topic a little bit secret just for storytelling purposes. That is what I'm here to do after all. It's kind of a little bit hard to get into this one. And when I got the topic last night, I did a little research online to check for a couple names that I had heard and had been thinking about. I don't like wearing my glasses while I tell these stories because I feel like little Orphan Annie with the sun shining on my eyes. Anyway, in researching this topic last night, I ran across something that I want to talk about a little bit. TED Talks. A friend of mine who's a professor at Columbia recently asked me, he's like, when did TED Talks become such a cultural currency? And I had to stop and think what he meant by that. And on the one hand, he was talking about his students who feel like if they can cite a TED Talk that says something that's the ultimate body of knowledge that is irrefutable by anyone. And then secondly, there's a whole band of people running around who've done TED Talks and TEDx Talks that once you've presented on that stage and in that forum, you become the de facto expert. Never had really thought about it in those terms then, but I kind of have fallen prey to that too. I sometimes cite TED Talks just as a stepping off point for a lot of the talks that I do. So, interesting question. But that all said, in prepping last night, I found a TED Talk by Emily Wapnick. She went on to describe what she calls multi-potentialites. That answering that age-old question of what do you want to be when you grow up. Her summation statement was, "It is rarely a waste of time to practice something you love, even if eventually you walk away from it." I posted that to my Facebook wall earlier this morning just as a little capture, just to get me in the mindset for talking about this. And a good friend of mine who's a Bach flower expert posted "Sow wild oats." I did the Bach flower technique training a couple of years ago, and in addition to all the remedies and the things that they do, they also have this way of categorizing different personality types. And when we got to the part of the class where we started categorizing different people in the class, it was determined that I was a wild oat, which I think is kind of funny. So wild oat compared with multi-potentialite. I've always thought of myself as a job collector or a hobby collector. When I was a kid, I think it kind of drove my parents crazy. I remember being in I don't know, 5th or 6th grade, and my mother got so angry at me. We were at a department store, and somehow I'd gotten on being a sculptor. I wanted to be like a stone sculptor, and it was all I could talk about. It's I talked about rock, I talked about this, I talked about the Ringling School of Art in the town that we lived in. I talked about, Mom, can we just go by and look? Mom, can we do this? And she's like, one day she's like, can you just give it a rest? And the wild oat multi-potentialite thing is, you're a kid that you get into a thing. It's all I want to do is play the saxophone, Mom. It's all about the saxophone. I want to hear the saxophone. I want to hear other people play the saxophone. I want to go see the saxophone concert. No, I don't play the saxophone anymore. Now I play the bagpipes. The bagpipes are more cool. The bagpipes, they're more historic. They're more about our family. They really dig into this tradition. I really love playing the bagpipes. Now I'm really into the bagpipes. No, I don't play the bagpipes anymore. I'm really into riding bikes now. I really like riding bikes because bikes make me healthy. Bikes make me more strong. Bikes make me a better person. So I'm going to set aside all of that and just do this and focus on the biking right now, because the cycling really makes me so happy, and it really gets me in tune with myself, and I've really found who my true self is. Now I've done this 30 or 40 times in my life. Anyone who's met me knows, there's a new hobby about, I don't know, every couple of years. I talked about Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours to become an expert at something, and I feel like most of my life I have become an expert, and just as I've, mastered something, it's about time to give it up and move on to the next thing. This is what she's talking about when she talks about these multi-potentialites, or what they talk about with wild oats. You're really into something, then you move on, and this is necessarily a bad thing. that, society judges us for this and says, you should pick something and stick with it and become the master of it. I think that there is some truth to that, but I think there is some truth to what Emily was saying with that we can, these multi-potentialite people actually do have skills because of the way they're not afraid to approach things and not afraid to think about the world in a different way than I must stick with this. It's like the more knowledge I can gain, the more pools of knowledge, those overlapping layers of information are actually what gives me my ability to be part of this world. So she goes on, just look it up. I mean, if you look up multi-potentialite, I'm sure you can find it that way. But this really is not the point of the story today. The point of the story is talking a little bit about this whole monomania thing. And the first time I came in contact with the word monomania was through the book, The Orchid Thief. A guy in Florida got obsessed with chasing different wild orchids down in the Everglades. And the book was somewhat about that, but then went on to introduce the concept of monomania, and that's when I sort of started to begin to identify with it. Now, when we start talking about monomania, and this is where my story begins, they talk about that we are that type, but they don't really talk about why we're that type. So when I started thinking about it, so it's like, why am I this person that goes from one thing to the next thing, that wants on to go on to the next thing? And I started thinking about, again, when I was a kid, my story is that it was a compensation for dyslexia. I was always a bright person, but I did not perform well in school, let's put it that way. Actually, I performed well in school. I did not test well in school, which is one of the things that kind of confounded my teachers. My mother was my first grade teacher, which is a whole other story into itself, but she tried to teach me to read and failed. My second grade teacher tried to teach me and thought she had. This went on until I was about in fourth grade, when my fifth grade teacher finally realized that I could not read at all, and I had just been faking it by listening to the conversations around me and just sort of saying what I needed to say and writing down kind of what needed to be written down, even though I was always held back in spelling and reading, and the math was always messed up, but anything that had social skills to it, I started leaning to. So I wanted to always be considered bright. I wanted to be in the better classes. I didn't want to get put in the dumb classes. So I learned how to be a fringe person. So what is a fringe person? A fringe person is not an outsider. An outsider is someone that wants nothing to do with the crowd, that wants nothing to do with being a part of that thing. I desperately wanted to be a part, but I knew that I could not compete with the people that were good test takers. So what did I have? I had an ability to get up in front of people and talk without being afraid, so I leaned into that. And I had an ability to make and do. So let's give it an example of this. English teacher says, read this book and write a 10-page paper about it and hand it in on Friday. And I say, what if I read the book? And instead of doing the 10-page paper, I come in and do this oral report, and I make it seem like it's for extra credit. Like, if I do this extra work, you can grade me the same amount, but I want to put a little bit of extra in it because I'm really excited about what we're doing here, and I'd really like to take it a little bit to that extra level. Or I'd like to make this diorama in addition to it, and I can tell the class about it, and we can bring them in, and we can, explain all of this, how this works. And I think this interactive model actually might be better than just handing you a 10-page paper. Maybe 6 times out of 10, I was successful at talking them into this. The reason I did this was not because of the extra credit or I wanted to work extra hard. It was my only way of competing. I knew that the other people could jot that stuff down, write it in, get it done, put it in, and the teacher would be happy. They'd get an A or B and be done. I would struggle with it for weeks and, barely get by with a C. I could get up in front of the class and do this oral report, though, without really even thinking about it and being done with it. So I started thinking that for me to compete, for me to succeed, I had to do something slightly different than everyone else. And I think that slightly different than everyone else is where the multi-potentialite thing came out in me. If I can do this a little bit better, or if I can find this other thing that's just a little bit quirkier, then I can set myself apart from these people because I cannot compete with them head to head, straight up. I'm against you, you're against me. It's like, no, I'm doing this other thing over here that, while slightly different, is still comparative, and I can still get a grade and still be a part of the smart people crowd. So it was basically a compensation survival thing, I think, because I didn't want anyone to know that I wasn't as smart. I didn't want anyone to know that I couldn't read, and I didn't want anyone to know that I couldn't keep up. I mean, I sometimes wonder what it would be like if I was in, like, a school system now that recognized that the way I process things is a fairly common way and can be dealt with, and not in the way that I had to hide it for 30 years, but that's the way it was. So by the time I had, grown up and moved away, I was a collector. I collected jobs. I've been a personal trainer. I helped develop derivative spreadsheet add-ins for derivatives traders on Wall Street. I've, done all the advertising stuff that I'll talk about some other time. I've had odd jobs. I was head of the costume shop department for the Macy's Thanksgiving Parade one year. I painted faux finishes on the Virginia Theater when they, retook it in the 70s. The Virginia Theater, they gutted it for Carrie the musical and made it a complete black box. And sometime in the mid-90s, they decided to restore it to its somewhat Victorianness and decided to paint all of these faux bois finishes all over the theater. And somehow I convinced someone there to let me come in and do that. And by the time it was over, I was able to work there 18 hours a day. That's what I really loved about these odd jobs when I was younger, is ones where I could go in and work. Like, I could start and I could work for 16 hours straight. They were paying me by the hour. It was a set amount of time, and then it was going to be done on a certain day. Those jobs gave me a lot of thrill because it was like competing against the time clock to see how much you could bank before it was done. So this whole Fringer lifestyle, the more it pushes me, then I got into thinking about, well, where does it all go? Or does it all really matter? Or can I just believe in myself that not really having a path or not really having a plan, but being able to believe in the next thing just makes the path reveal itself? Quit worrying about what I want to be when I grow up. Quit worrying about, how does this fit into the last thing that you're doing? And if you feel the passion for it, just move forward. I think that's mostly the story for today. Now, one of the things that I've been really concerned about with these stories is I feel like I get to the end of them and it's either one feels like a therapy session or two has to have some sort of loose moral. Trying to figure out how to move away from that. Okay, now I'm to the notes section of what I just did. I need to make eye contact with you guys a little bit better. I'm not speaking in my real voice. There's a whole showman thing, like when I'm speaking I really put on this really big voice and that's who I am when I'm at a speaking engagement, but then when I'm sitting here talking to you or petting the cat I put on this other different voice. And sometimes to tell the stories I feel like I have to put on the bigger voice. But I'm doing this in my living room at 7:30 in the morning before Michael wakes up, so I also want to be respectful for the people sitting around me. Anyway, that was number 3. Let's call it monomania. No, let's call it Fringer. Story number 3, Fringer. Thanks, guys.